Hello to the pessimistic, optimistic, and everyone in between. My name is Connor Philippi, and welcome back to the Minnesotan Sports Podcast. And took a quick break for some busy stuff going on, and a lot happened during that time. Obviously, the biggest part of the season with Week 17 now looming. A lot happened last week, and the playoff picture in some ways shifted, in some ways didn't. For a football nerd like I am, this is such a fun part of the season where you can just scoreboard watch, and I've never been more excited to have Sunday NFL ticket than this weekend. But anyway, we'll start off here with the AFC East. It's been kind of a battle throughout this season that people didn't really see coming, with the Patriots coming out of nowhere. They are currently leading that division 12-3 with the Buffalo Bills behind them at 11-4. So the big thing here is the division tiebreaker, because Buffalo Bills are 3-2 within the division. The Patriots are 3-1 within the division. But basically what needs to happen is the Bills need to win out, and we need to have the Patriots lose to the Dolphins or the Jets in order for the Bills to have a chance within the AFC East. The reason for that being, if New England loses to one of those two teams, they fall to 3-2 within the division, which is where Buffalo would be 2, and then the rest of the games would all tally out to Buffalo being 4-2, New England being 4-2, and then the tiebreaker would be those common games. And in that case, the Buffalo Bills would win that tiebreaker. So the Bills are hoping for a loss for the Patriots to the Dolphins or Jets, which will be very difficult with those two teams kind of tanking at the end of the season. But you never know. You see a lot of these situations where these teams just like playing spoiler at this point in the season. Moving on now to the AFC North, the Pittsburgh Steelers, really the only chance that they have of losing the AFC North at this point is by losing out, and for the Baltimore Ravens to win out against some good teams. This one's pretty much wrapped up, but you can't ever say never. Crazier things have happened, but basically the Steelers have 3-1 within the division. Baltimore has 3-2. So since the Steelers are playing both of their last two games against divisional opponents, they technically could lose out, and that tiebreaker would then go to the Ravens. Probably the least likely scenario of all of these. And especially because the Pittsburgh Steelers are playing the Browns and then the Ravens at the end of the season. So crazier things have happened. The Steelers could lose to the Browns. Myles Garrett's chasing after that sack record. He's going to be on his game. And this Browns team has been kind of on their game the last couple of weeks, still not necessarily with any success in terms of the win columns, but they're giving a lot of teams a run for their money. Of course, the Judkins injury certainly complicates things in that regard too, because he was a big reason for why they were staying in games too. But we'll have to see what happens there. Very unlikely that the Ravens can come back and win that division. Then we move on here to the AFC South, where the Jacksonville Jaguars are trying to clinch that division. If the Jags lose one of their next two and the Texans win out, then the Texans would win that division. Because of division tiebreakers, Houston is currently 4-1 within the division. That's a huge factor there. Taking a look here for the Jaguars, they play the Colts and then the Tennessee Titans. That Colts game, obviously, with the Colts pretty much out of the running for the playoffs, with Phillip Rivers not really playing very well in that last game, and their defense kind of starting to slack off a little bit. Not very likely there. And then, of course, the Titans are a total long shot. But it would be interesting because, again, the Jags would only need to lose one of those two for that to be the case. But then you take a look here at the Texans' schedule, and they have one of the most difficult schedules to finish off the season, because they have to go up against the LA Chargers next week on the 27th on Saturday, and then they play the Colts at the end of the season, who are going to be trying to play spoiler. But again, crazier things have happened, and this Texans team very much in the running for the wild card standings, which we'll talk about later. But obviously, this AFC South, very important. Next, we move on here to the AFC West. The Chargers are sitting one game back on the Broncos. Of course, the big thing here is that the Chargers beat the Broncos the last time they played them. And so really the situation here is if the Chargers win their next one and the Broncos win their next one, then it doesn't really matter what happens there. The Chargers can still beat the Broncos, and they have that tiebreaker. The only way that the Broncos can win the division outright is if the Broncos win this next one and the Chargers lose this next one. Honestly, if the Chargers win this week, it doesn't really even matter if the Broncos lose, because in that case, unless there's some crazy tie situation, obviously a division would still go to the Chargers. So basically, Chargers, if they win, then no matter what happens, they have a shot of winning this division, and it could make for a really interesting conclusion. But again, the Chargers play the Texans, who are also trying to fight for their division, so that's going to be a really good matchup on Saturday at 3:30 for that game. That rounds out the AFC, so it's going to be a really good battle for all of those divisions. Of course, the Steelers is going to be a little bit of a cakewalk unless some crazy things happen, but it's fun to see, at the very least, the possibility that every single one of these teams still has a shot and that every single division has not been won yet. Now, speaking of divisions that have already been won, we turn our attention to the NFC with the NFC East, where the Eagles have already won their division. They are 10-5, and the next closest team 6-8 in the Dallas Cowboys. Of course, the Commanders were expected to be their top competition this season. They just did not play up to par. Even when Jane Daniels was in, they did not get it done. And so that's a team that is going to be kind of in a weird situation where you know that they can get to that point again. I mean, they went to the NFC Championship just last year, so it's not like they're going to be rebuilding, but they also do get a really good draft pick to boot from that. And so that's going to make things definitely interesting. But the Philadelphia Eagles have won that division at this point. They're just fighting for the playoffs here. Moving on now to the NFC North. This is also a very interesting one because basically the Bears need to lose out and the Packers need to win out if the Bears or the Packers are going to win that division. But you have to keep in mind here, the Bears play San Francisco and Detroit in the last 2 weeks of the season. Even if Detroit ends up being knocked out by that next week, you better believe that Detroit's going to come out swinging. And in fact, they just a couple years ago knocked the Packers out of the playoffs in that exact way. And so you can never count the Lions out even when they are mathematically out of the playoffs. The Packers play the Ravens and the Vikings to finish off the season. The Ravens are certainly never going to quit, even with some of the struggles they've had, most likely going to be out of the playoffs by this point. And then we've got the Vikings who, if J.J. McCarthy comes back, they're not going to be a slouch by any means. They want to knock the Packers out of the playoffs. So it's not a walk in the park for the Packers either. But if they can find a way to win out, it's not out of the realm of possibility that a Bears team that has been known to collapse in the past, obviously this is a very different Bears team, I am aware of that, but they've been known to collapse in the past, and they're playing two very good teams in the 49ers and Lions, so definitely something to still monitor in the last 2 weeks of the season. If not, it's looking very likely that this might just be a matchup between the Bears and the Packers to finish or to go into the wild card round. Now moving on here to the NFC South, which is another very interesting division that has a few kind of random nuances to it that we have to get into, because basically the Carolina Panthers are sitting at 8-7. The Tampa Bay Bucks are sitting at 7-8. There's a lot of different tiebreakers that are potentially in play. If the Panthers win next week and the Bucks lose next week, it's over. The Panthers win the division. They'd be up by 2 games. Tampa Bay Buccaneers are 2-3 within the division. Carolina Panthers are 3-2. Of course, we're looking at a potential scenario where the Bucks could beat the Panthers in that last week of the season. That would end up being tied 3-3. The Buccaneers have the best strength of schedule in common games because obviously that's the next tiebreaker that comes into play. If both teams lose or both teams win, then the Buccaneers can win that next week, and they would be the ones in the playoffs and on top in the NFC South. Now, if the Bucks lose to the Dolphins next week and the Panthers lose to the Seahawks, and then the Bucks beat the Panthers, you'd think that no matter what, the Bucks are in the playoffs. But no, there's a third scenario where if the Falcons win out, then all 3 teams would be tied at 8-9 within the division. Then it would come down to the tiebreaker being the winners of the most games within those 3 teams. So like the common game tiebreaker between just the games all 3 of those teams have played. And in that situation, the Panthers would win that one. So that's where it gets complicated. That's the only situation where the Panthers can lose to the Bucks and still win the division if they don't win next week and the Bucks don't lose next week. So just to recap, if both teams win or both teams lose, the Bucks can win and win the division. The Panthers would win that next week and also win the division. So it would come down to just who wins that week. But if both teams lose and the Falcons win out, the Panthers would still win the division. If that all makes sense. Finally, we have the NFC West, which is such a toss-up at this point still that I'm not going to go into all the different scenarios that could potentially happen. Basically, the Seattle Seahawks are sitting at 12-3, where the San Francisco 49ers are 11-4, and the Los Angeles Rams are also sitting at 11-4. Basically, if you take a look here at the tiebreakers, San Francisco has the tiebreaker over Seattle. So, in a situation where both teams win or both teams lose, in that situation, obviously that would have to come with a caveat that the Rams also lose, because that's where it gets crazy. Basically, if the Seahawks win and the 49ers win, and the 49ers beat the Seahawks, then they are in for the division. If the Seahawks win out, obviously it doesn't matter. They win the division. And there's also a potential situation where all three teams could come into that last week all tied at 3 for the division as well. The Rams and the 49ers ended up tying with their head-to-head on the season. So then the next thing you got to look at is the division records, where the 49ers are 4-1 within the division and the Rams are 3-2 within the division. So basically, the Rams need the 49ers to lose in some capacity. If the Rams can win out and then the 49ers lose next week but then beat the Seahawks the week after that, then the Rams would move ahead the 49ers. So then I'm doing this in real time to show you how crazy it all is. And looking at everything, currently the Seahawks have the head-to-head tiebreaker over the Rams, or excuse me, not the head-to-head tiebreaker, the common games tiebreaker, which is pretty much the last tiebreaker. I apologize if any of that was wrong, but that is basically the breakdown of this race between all three of these teams. Of course, really the only way for the Rams to get above the Seahawks is if they lose both games, but even in that situation, they would have to get ahead of the 49ers somehow, which the 49ers do have a couple of tough opponents coming up against the Bears and then against the Seahawks. So there's a chance still that the Rams could sneak in as well, but they would definitely need some help. So there's other situations in play with that division, but there's just so many that I really can't get into anything else other than that. On top of all that, there's tiebreakers all over the place in the wild card picture. I'm going to wait until next week to fully break down all of those because we could be here for 40 minutes breaking all that down. But basically, the Broncos are 12-3. The Patriots are also sitting at 12-3. The Broncos have that tiebreaker over them based off of their common games win percentage because both teams are 7-3 within the conference. And so it'll come down to all of that. The Jacksonville Jaguars are sitting at 11-4, and they have an 8-2 conference tiebreaker. So they definitely want to win a couple of these games, see the Patriots or Broncos lose those games, and they honestly still have a path potentially to the number one seed if they can get that tiebreaker still going into the end of the season. And the Steelers have no shot at the 1 seed, sitting at 9-6 currently. They're, again, still just trying to lock down their division. The LA Chargers are sitting at 11-4, tied with the Buffalo Bills. They have the win percentage record in in conference games, but it's 8-2 versus 8-3. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of that plays out between those two seeds. Then we have the Texans, who are in the 7th seed right now. They're sitting at 10-5, and they are hoping to secure that playoff spot because they're just trying to fend off at this point the Indianapolis Colts. The only reason you see the Ravens sitting at the bottom of the wild card standing is because they don't have the X because they just aren't eliminated from the playoffs in general yet because they technically could still win their division, but they are out of the race for the wild card spot. So it's basically between the Colts and the Texans. In that situation, the Colts would need the Texans to lose out in order to get that 7th spot. So Texans are sitting pretty well at this point, but obviously they don't have a cakewalk of a schedule the rest of the way, which will make things interesting. As for the NFC, we have the Seahawks currently sitting with the number 1 seed. They have the same record in the conference as the Chicago Bears. So those tiebreakers obviously come into question as well for that number 1 seed. Again, the Bears have some tough opponents left. So if I had to guess, I would say the Seahawks would still come away with that number 1 seed. And honestly, if the 49ers leap ahead of the Seahawks, there's still a chance they get the number 1 seed, with the fact that the Bears will most likely lose at least one of their last 2 games, especially considering the fact that they would need to lose out both of those games. Philadelphia Eagles sitting at the 3rd seed. It's looking unlikely that they'll get the number 1 seed, but they could certainly leap ahead for the 2nd, depending on how Chicago does those last 2 weeks like I just talked about. Eagles are most likely sitting pretty at that number 3 spot at the very worst, because I very much doubt that Carolina or Tampa Bay is going to be able to get above them in that regard. Then you have the 49ers sitting at 5, and then the Rams at 6. Obviously, there could potentially be a lot of change within those 2 teams with the teams they play, with the way that the NFC West could still shift around. And then you have that final 7th seed with the Green Bay Packers, and they basically would need to lose out, and Detroit would have to win out in order to get that spot, with Green Bay playing a couple teams, like I said, that are definitely not gimmies, and the Detroit Lions finishing off their season going up against Minnesota and Chicago. It's not out of the realm of possibility, especially with the Packers' recent injuries. I just don't necessarily see it happening. So it's in my opinion, I think we have our field, besides the final division spot in the NFC South. I think we pretty much have our 14 teams in that regard. We basically have 15 teams vying for the playoffs, even though it's possible the Ravens sneak in. I think we have 15 teams that really have a shot at being in the playoffs right now, which makes things very interesting down the stretch. But thank you so much for watching this one. Make sure you stay tuned for my next video, where I'm going to be giving my game-by-game picks and predictions for Week 17. But thank you so much for watching this one. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the flip side.